So it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Phil Harrington. I've come to know Phil primarily through the Humanities Committee. Historians are divided about how many years he's been on the Humanities Committee, but it's somewhere around 6 years. And because he's come to the end of his 2 legal terms of service, he is moving over to the Fine Arts Curriculum Committee so that he can be promoting and presenting classes in art history and cinema. Philip has quite a wide range of interests. He has presented classes for HASP on Julia Alvarez's novel, Time of the Butterflies, The Gospel According to Mark, The Art of Kayaking, The Culture of the Caribbean, which I now know, where I now know Philip spent some childhood years, and most recently, the concept of time in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Right? He wrote me a note, and I think I'm going to read this word for word because I think it's wonderful. Phil wants us to know that he always presents classes about things he knows something about, but not enough. He is in this for the sake of learning. I think that's a wonderful way to think of it. Oh, I neglected to mention that he has a BA from George Washington University and both an MA and MDiv from the Pacific School of Religion, which remarkably enough is on the Atlantic coast. No, I was just seeing if you're paying attention. Does anyone need a hard copy of the syllabus? Or do you all have a copy? Okay, good. How do I get one to her?
Hannah will print one out for you. Okay. So, and if you could do that quickly, then she could have it in front of her.
Okay. So welcome, Philip.
Right. Thank you, Doug. I wanted to stress that fact that I like my history is to teach things that I know something about, but not enough about, because I want to come across as a learner rather than an expert. And that can be good, but it also has a negative to it that you're going to get the perspective from my interest, what I want to know more about. And as has happened before, the basis of this class is my return to a paper that I wrote in graduate school. And I decided that it needed further attention because my understanding of the relationship between faith and science, my own perspective and my experience of both those have changed since I was in graduate school in the 80s. And our world has changed, and the relationship between faith and science is become critical, again, but also has changed somewhat. And going back to my paper, I realized that some of my conclusions were a little bit deficient, and I've changed, and also the language that I use. And the one particular quote I'm going to show you in a minute that I not only proudly portrayed on the front of my paper, but I've used as kind of a motto in my life. And I still believe in it wholeheartedly. Comes from George MacDonald. And yet I have to cringe because of the way some of our time has changed whenever I use it anymore. So I thought I should address that. The title is Faith, Science, and Fairy Tales. And George MacDonald is only in the subtitle. Now, I know that George MacDonald got used as the primary title in some of the documents. And so I hope that you will put up with the fact that today we're not going to get to George MacDonald's actual work at all. We will be doing the background. So if you have no interest in the relationship between faith and science, and particularly their relationship in the 19th century, you might feel a little bit out of place. I hope that's not the case. I will apologize in advance. Since that is our title, I'm going to start with some definitions. At least these are hard things to define. You can define them differently, but this is the basic understanding I'm approaching the subject matter with. I'm defining faith as religious belief, transcendent knowledge. That means knowledge that is not limited to the fact that these two books are on this table, which is made of, we could analyze the number of components of that table, but that's empirical knowledge. And faith takes us into other things. The non-materialist approach to life. In other words, faith deals with invisible reality, things that it will call real, but can't be proven because they are invisible. All right. And science, on the other hand, deals with the factual data that can be examined and determinations made about them. In other words, testable knowledge rather than transcendent knowledge. It deals with the physical, visible, or material reality around us. Pretty clear? Or any question? Okay, all right. Now, I thought we should define fairy tale, because there are different ways to define that. I'm using fairy tale to refer to fantasy literature, literature that is the product of somebody's creative imagination. Okay, so not the real world. It's not documentary. It's not realistic fiction or historical fiction. But fairy tales are tales that are not bound to the knowable empirical world around us. They don't have to deal specifically with fairies, although in England in particular, fairies were at an important contribution. But it definitely means more than tales about fairies. Now, myth is another term that I want to define because it has a loosey-goosey definition. I refer to myth as foundational or explanatory narratives that convey the beliefs of a culture. In other words, they are not looking at them objectively. They don't relate to historical reality. Sometimes people within a culture live by myths that they perceive as historical or relating to the empirical world, but looking at them objectively, they don't. And they are generally anonymously authored. That's another important distinction, is that nobody sits down and just creates this myth. The myth is created by the refinement of a story, an idea, through several minds and it has lasted for a long time, gone through an evolution. And that way, it can be said to represent a truth about a culture because it has had some lasting value. It's not just one person's creation. Like, we can read stories of the Amazons, okay? But nobody sat down and wrote those stories. We have Xena Warrior Princess, who is a product of that concept of the Amazon women of the Greeks. But it was created in a television writer's office. You know, they collectively came up with Xena Warrior Princess. You can find her origin as opposed to the tales of the Amazons. And then I used in the course description the term mythopoeic. Is one of the descriptions of George MacDonald's writings from W.H. Auden, but other people use this word mythopoeic. And what it refers to is imaginative storytelling that was written by a known author, but approaches the nature and power of myth. By the way, the thing I hope was obvious here, we're not using the contemporary, more recent conception of myth as something that's not true. Okay, so myth does not mean a lie or a falsehood. Myth means something that could very well be true, but it's not dependent upon empirical evidence. But the idea of myth as the opposite of truth is one you've got to separate, because we're going back a little to its original meaning here. You have to separate that notion that myth is false. And so it's, and some people will claim that you can tell a myth is true if it does still have power today. And so some writers, people can discern that same kind of power. There's some kind of witness to truth in it. It has a lasting value, and it points to something that extends beyond one particular generation of time. In other words, more than just one person may have written it, but that person has tapped into something deeper. Anyway, we won't talk about that a whole lot today, but that's important to know. Here's that quote from George MacDonald. A dream may be full of truth, and a fact may be a mere shred for the winds of the limbo of vanities. Beautiful statement. I love it. But do you see how it's problematic today? Today, the idea of facts has come under attack. And that's, I don't think, what George MacDonald had intended. And so I want to convey, I'm going to do that with the help of drawing two circles around faith and science. Now, please understand that I can't prove that those two circles don't interlap at all. Their relationship has changed over the course of history. Their relationship to each other has changed. Sometimes they were kind of almost in the same circle. There was a time when before science meant testing something, exploring, improving it, doing experiments on it. Sometimes science was taken for granted because Aristotle said so, or Pythagoras said so. So that there's a change here, but I want to look at them for our purpose right here as two separate spheres of looking or knowing at the world. And in that circle of faith, I don't mean just, we're talking about the 19th century Britain, so that's the Christian faith, but our conversation for this course extends beyond that. So in that circle of faith, you can put another religion, you can put Jung's concept of the unconscious, collective unconscious, you know, the idea that we all can share the same dreams, you know, that there are archetypes that we all know by some inbred nature, that we are connected in ways that we don't realize, something he can't prove, that nobody can necessarily prove, or other things that don't depend on empirical proof. And then science, again, as I said, are the things that you can. And let's put dream in this circle of faith, and fact in the circle of science. These did clash in the 19th century in dramatic ways. And what I want to say is that just because George MacDonald can say a particular dream may have more value or more worth than a particular fact, like knowing exactly what this table is made of. That fact may not have lasting value to your life or my life, and yet a dream might. He was not implying that facts were not important. Within the sphere of science, facts are drastically important. In other words, nothing in this sphere on the right can disqualify the facts in the left. You can't have a dream or belief that directly contradicts the facts in the other circle. Even though you might have one that might be important than some facts, you cannot negate facts on the other end. In other words, MacDonald wasn't saying that he was not saying that there are such things as alternative facts. That has become an expression in our day and age. My way of looking at these two circles imply that an alternative fact is simply a lie. And a lie is dangerous to both these spheres. So now we got that straight. I'm going to come back to that quote eventually, but you might wonder, why concern ourselves with what they felt about these things in the 19th century? Why are we looking at the 19th century at all and reading the stories of the 19th century? Okay. I forgot to, I'm working with two here because I have my notes on one computer. Okay. I see, I didn't, yeah. The 19th century has been called the first era of unprecedented change. That claim has to be qualified somewhat, so we will do it this way. The 19th century was unprecedented in the sense of the rapidity of the change, how quickly the world was changing. There have been other great eras of change in history, but the 19th century change was the quickest anybody had noticed things changing. And the concentration of change, it wasn't just change in one area. It wasn't just thought, philosophies or art, like say in the Renaissance. It was change that was affecting every dimension of life. And the third factor was that the average person was aware of living in the midst of an upheaval. The Renaissance didn't get its name until long after. There were people living during the Renaissance who didn't know anything that was going on and changing. Not everybody was aware of the changes. They were slow enough and they didn't affect as much of their lives. But nobody living in the 19th century, in England particularly, or Britain, was unaware that the world was no longer the same. Things were different and they weren't going to go back. At the beginning of the 19th century, this is how you got around. You wanted to get from one place in Britain to another place in Britain, so from Edinburgh to Scotland or say, this is how you did it. This is how you also communicated with others, is by sending post that got a letter that got delivered on a coach like this. Some people had the ability to ride their own horse, but the horse was the means of communication and travel. At the end of the 19th century, long before the end of the 19th century, exactly, however, in particular, this is how you got around. By the railway. This is how your mail got transported via a brand new invention called the train. This is how you communicated. Well, not everybody had the wherewithal to communicate this way, but you could communicate this way rather than writing a letter and sending it on either the stagecoach or the train. You could take it to a telegraph office who could instantaneously translate your words into electrical pulses that somebody could read instantaneously miles away. In fact, it was during the middle of the 19th century that England was able to send messages first. I think they first had telegraph cables to India, communicate with India, and then eventually across the Atlantic. So instantaneous communication. Go from horseback to that, and you know that something has happened. A device, a machine has changed. 19th century Britain can be separated into two different eras, the Romantic era and the Victorian era. The first part of the first 3 decades, basically, people argue about where the dividing line is in the 30s, whether it was with Victoria's coronation, and which I believe was 1837, or people use different factors to determine it. It's a loose division, in other words, but basically the first 3 decades of the last 6.5 decades. You might be helped by identifying some names of authors with these 2 different eras. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Have you heard of them? Okay, at least 1 or 2 of them you've heard of. They were all poets. Blake is sometimes considered a romantic, more in the sense of a predecessor to the romantic age. I like to stick to the 5 because I have 5 fingers. I can memorize that. And it's interesting to notice that these are in the order of their birth. Wordsworth was born first, Coleridge, then Byron, then Shelley, and the youngest of them was Keats. They died in reverse order. Keats died first, then Shelley, then Byron, then Coleridge, and Wordsworth outlasted them all. Wordsworth was considered kind of the father of the Romantic era. In the Victorian era, notice that I have a lot more names there. A lot more writing was going on. And of those, only Tennyson, Browning, and Arnold were known as poets. That's important. All 5 of those names in the Romantic era were poets. Only a fraction, a minority. The others were either essayists, or philosophical writers, lecturers that, like, Carlyle, John Stuart Mill, Huxley, Engels. He was Karl Marx's partner in England. Charles Kingsley, John Ruskin, and John Henry Newman, church leader, but very, very important to theology and philosophy. So a lot more prose was being written and fiction. Dickens and George Eliot, very big novels, and the Brontes. You've heard of the Bronte sisters. There were others, but these are where I stopped. So you can see there's kind of a shift away from poetry that we'll talk about later. But we want to know primarily what was going on science-wise. 1859 is when Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. And it was a pivotal work in the sense that it sparked a lot of debate. And it was when things kind of came to the focus. You couldn't escape what science was doing. Darwin was not the first to talk about evolution. He was not the first to talk to make a bold scientific discovery. He was indebted to others who led up to the publication of The Origin of Species, but he became the pivotal point. people used his name more often than the others. It was like, I don't know, what was a good analogy, a lightning rod or something like that. Before Darwin's Origin of the Species, there were important works by Herschel. Natural philosophy was the name for, they didn't have a name for geology yet. It was natural philosophy, and a lot of things came under that. But he wrote primarily about the age of the earth. Lyell was a significant author at that time as well, Principles of Geology, talking about the fact that we know that the earth is old. Its changes are going on and have been going on for a long time. Buckland was another important author. Someone who first felt he had to write under pseudonym, later became identified as Chambers, I forget his first name, wrote Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, again talking about the idea that we're talking about long eons of processes. Lyell came back with another important book after Darwin, supporting Darwin's work, Evidences of the Antiquity of Man. So Darwin was not alone. He was not a radical in that sense, but he was an important figure. And there's another person I've added just recently, just like last week, and talking about I'm not an expert on science, but I've tried to stay in touch with scientists. And I have a friend who is a geologist, retired from the department here in Hope. And he insisted that I talk about this man. Does anyone recognize him? Would you know who he was if I gave you his name as James Hutton? Now are bells ringing? Okay, so I'm glad that I added him. He insisted that I do that. He was called a natural philosopher again, but geologists call him the father of modern geology. Since geology wasn't a term used much, the father of geology. He was the one who first made the claims. He was the teacher of Lyell, that is the name you saw on the list. He was the one who first made the claim that the evidence shows a long history to the earth. These things, the changes that he could point to going on in the rock, these are changes that you cannot conceive of happening quickly. They took eons and eons of time. So I wanted also to make sure that he was on the list here. And he wasn't Lyell's teacher, he was Buckland's teacher. He may have taught Lyell too, I'm sure that they communicated, but he was Buckland's teacher. I wanted to make sure that you know his name because he was also from Scotland. And you'll be seeing how Scotland influenced what was going on in England extensively, and a lot of, like George MacDonald. Okay, Charles Darwin, two words are associated with him: evolution and natural selection. I've alluded to the fact that Charles Darwin did not invent the notion of evolution, that it existed. His own father had talked about it, and others on the continent, had described the possibility of the evolution of the human species. So that was not radically new. People didn't talk about it much until Darwin wrote his the Origin of the Species. But it was not it wasn't dependent upon Charles Darwin. Natural selection was his unique contribution as the mechanism by which evolution took place. The fact that species changed for a purpose, to survive as a species, certain traits were held on to and others were dismissed. Natural selection. And it was natural selection that was the crisis of faith for Darwin, because Darwin was a firm believer. He had entertained ideas of studying for the ministry. before he went into science. And the concept of evolution did not trouble him at all, biblically or theologically. But this idea of natural selection did, because it meant that the world was in a state of violence with itself. One creature had to devour another creature to survive. Now that is there's more to natural selection than that. Perhaps more important, I've been told, is the fact that natural selection has to do with reproduction, the best way to reproduce yourself. But still, implied there is that we live in a world where one creature eats another to remain alive. And what I want to point out is that this is not an anti-religious view or an anti-biblical view, because the biblical writers themselves reveal a troubling response, the idea that one creature's got to eat another creature. It was not a concept. They knew that it existed, but it was not a concept that they enjoyed. And so you will find in the prophetic writings in particular, this notion that it wasn't always so, and it won't always be so. This is one artist's depiction of what we call the peaceable kingdom. Isaiah and other prophets had this vision of a world where creatures lived together in harmony, because we are unsatisfied. The biblical writers way before Christ were just as unsatisfied with this notion of natural selection as Darwin was. So even though evolution itself wasn't new, Darwin's book did make a radical impact and a backlash, in fact. There was, in Darwin's day, an edition of the King James Bible that had imprinted in the pages as an introduction to the Bible, this date as the date of creation, listed as a fact that God created. What you read in Genesis 1 took place on October 23 in the year 4004 at 9 o'clock in the morning. This was the figure of the calculation of a bishop in Ireland by the name of James Ussher in the 17th century. It's also was later attributed to someone, John Lightfoot in Cambridge, a scholar at Cambridge University. However, I believe those who say that Lightfoot was dependent upon Ussher rather than the other way around. But you may have heard that name Ussher before. And so that was still, even though it was a 17th century calculation, and Ussher wasn't the first to try to calculate the date. Isaac Newton even had a calculation similar to this. I don't know if he had a time of day, but he had a year roughly about the same, based on the biblical writings and not his scientific calculations. But it was a prominent assumption. And suddenly all these writings on geology and particularly, Darwin, you could no longer accept this date. So there was a reaction. Thomas Huxley is one of the names that became known following Darwin. He became known as Darwin's chief promoter, champion. He was not known as an hands-on scientist himself, but a philosopher who wrote about science. And when Darwin is getting all the criticism he was the one of them that stood up for Darwin. He was not known as a very religious person himself. Samuel Wilberforce is another name that you may have heard of. He was a bishop, and he was very vociferous in opposing Charles Darwin and other scientists of the age. But I want to stress that this debate that began with Darwin's work was not a scientist versus clergy affair. The church wasn't lined up on one side and the scientist on the other side. Remember that Darwin himself is, well, almost all scientists of that era had studied theology. The church operated the schools, the universities. Most everyone had to take some theological degree if they were going to get any education. And a good number of theologians and leaders in the church, as opposed to William Wilberforce, spoke up in favor of Charles Darwin and said that this is not to be scorned off or laughed off. So it was not a church versus science affair. In fact, I want to use the opportunity to bring up one of my heroes, historical figure, Gregor Mendel. If you don't know him, read about him. He was a unpretentious priest. I think he worked in a monastery. Using the monastery garden, he studied peas. And he is known as the father of geneticism because he traced and with minute detail, crossbred different pea varieties and figured out how they adapted, how they changed, how a trait got transposed to a new generation. His work is very important. It came after Darwin, but he presented it in 1865. Which was about 5 years after, 6 years after Darwin. He presented at a scientific organization. There were no questions afterward. He presented all of his findings. No one asked any questions. Presumption is they either didn't understand the impact of it or they didn't understand it at all. It wasn't until 35 years later, 16 years after his death, that someone discovered it and realized that Mendel's work held the key to understanding natural selection. And the process of the ongoing study of evolution would not have been possible without this priest's work. There were gaps in Darwin's knowledge of natural selection, things he wondered about, did not know. There were things that other people couldn't figure out. They knew it had to be true. It seemed to be true, but there were some holes. There were some gaps that need to be filled in, and Gregor Mendel provided them. Even though not all of the church was opposed, there was a reaction. I'm going to focus on the reaction to science in the 19th century on the part of various religiously minded folks. Some, of course, rejected the science outright, that if it contradicted the Bible, it had to be wrong. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay. Other people accepted it and decided that their faith had to go. So they sacrificed their Christian faith for the sake of this new science. And others made accommodation. So they didn't ditch their faith, but they reinterpreted the Bible in a way that allowed them to accept the science without giving up their faith. And I want to point out, because I like to listen to him, Neil deGrasse Tyson, if you've heard of him, he has a lot, he seems to be going the popular route, has a lot of YouTube videos out, and he said something that I can argue with. Most of it is, if his thinking is beyond me, but he said that it was science that forced the church to change its interpretation of the Bible, to treat these stories in Genesis, etc., as myth or as something other. And that is not true, because treating the Genesis stories as allegory goes back to Augustine, who purported that belief, that these were allegorical stories, and allegorical readings of the Bible were common. And they go back to Origen, even earlier than Augustine. And on the continent of Europe, there were German theologians who were starting to talk about the fact that we need to apply the test of literature, the way we test other literature, we've got to apply to the Bible, to the scriptures. And we're coming up with descriptions of biblical record that differ. We're not treating them as historical, or at least all of them. The life of Jesus was scrutinized. This was taking place independently of the science of the age. No doubt that the scientific revolution, hallmarked by Darwin, had an impact on this change of interpretation, but it was not a causal factor. Among those who denied, we've mentioned William Wilberforce. I want to point out that it was not just people in the church who denied the scientific evidence, but Benjamin Disraeli, twice Prime Minister of England, made similar comments as Wilberforce had done. And one of the things that they shared in common, and a lot of people did this, was to ridicule the notion of evolution on a false note. They would ridicule the idea that we were descended from monkeys or apes. And that falsehood, that misunderstanding still exists today, but it was there right from this. It was a nice little joke that they could make. That Wilberforce-Huxley debate wasn't really a formal debate between the two of them. That's where it was first noted, when Wilberforce asked Huxley whether it was on his mother's side or his father's side that he was descended of a monkey. And other people made statements like, I will, if you will allow me my ancestors in paradise, the Garden of Eden, I will allow you your ancestors at the Zoological Society or the Zoological Gardens. And I point out that misunderstanding of evolution for a particular reason is because it contains a sense of pride. You know, at least we're not descendants of monkeys. You know, that we are superior because you have such a crazy notion. And that pride influenced and sustained a lot of the anti-science arguments then and today. There was also, I should point out, a similar pride on the part of scientists or scientifically minded people in this age, where they took pride in the fact that they did not believe the silly notions of these religious fanatics. It did not characterize all the science of the age, but that did exist. We'll get to that a little bit later. Among those prominent folks who accepted the science and ditched their faith were Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin, very well-known literary figures. Thomas Carlyle, he abandoned his path to the ministry and started picking up the German romantic writers, mystical writers, novelists, and others. And you could probably say that he fit the mode of looking for spirituality without religion. So he had a negative response to religion, but he believed wholeheartedly in spiritual faith, and decried the unbelief of those who would only accept science and cast out belief. You might think of things like also like the AA, higher power, as a way of getting away from having to lock people into a religion and still accept a spiritual dimension to life. And Thomas Carlyle came up with several good terms like the holy infinite, or the what's another one of his the eternal unnameable was another one of his terms. However, he still did use the term God. He unabashedly used the term God very frequently. But you could tell he was no longer bound to a particular box of religion. But he was looking for some way to allow people to have faith in something other than science. John Ruskin, rather than turning so much to the German Romantic writers, promoted art, the value of art, and guiding people's see behind response not only of Carlyle and Ruskin, but of many people, there was, if they lost their faith, there was a sense of despondency about it. They didn't rejoice. Oh, good, now I'm free from that nonsense. They felt a loss. And so they were looking for some other place to put their faith. John Ruskin maybe never completely ditched the church. And it wasn't based on science. It was based morally, his rejection of the church was more on the hypocrisy that he witnessed in the church. And there was plenty of that. It was not science bringing down religion. There were problems in the religion of the day that were eating away at the popularity of the church already, before Darwin or anybody else. And one of them was hypocrisy. And John Ruskin had probably one of the best eyes of the era. He saw things, not just in art that no one else could see. He saw things in society. And he saw the hypocrisy of the church in ways that just caused him to bristle. So he wrote amazing works on art and architecture, but all of his works, whether they dealt specifically with society, all of them included society. He was one of my favorite discoveries when I was an undergraduate. I have immense respect to John Ruskin. What maybe they feared was that if you take away religious faith, people are going to start putting their faith in the machinery of the age, so that their faith will be mechanized. That somehow we will turn, if we just only worship science and what science can do for us, because science was not just a theoretical thing. Science, the growth of science was affecting people's lives in important ways. But there was a fear that if we just abandon our faith, we'll start worshiping that. And that could be destructive to the human spirit and psyche. Let's see, I got to move on here. Then there were the folks who did not outright ditch their faith, but realized that they needed to accommodate for it. And I've only named 4 here. They represent a whole lot of others, though. Alfred Lord Tennyson, you've probably heard about. Probably his longest poem is called In Memoriam, and it is an elegy for a dead friend, a friend of his similar age who died, too young. And he is lamenting. He is spending the whole poem lamenting the loss of his friend, and uses that experience to reflect also that despondence of the age of losing some cherished beliefs or having to readjust. And so it's also an elegy for an archaic expression of the fact that our belief is no longer simple as what it used to be. It ended, the long poem ends in some degree of affirmation. And these are two stanzas of his poem of In Memoriam that you can find in the Anglican hymnal. I don't know if it's still in the Episcopal hymnal, but strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him, thou art just. So taking seriously science and its changes, he ends up with an affirmation of faith. Robert Browning had a poem called Bishop Blogram's Apology, a Catholic bishop. He based it on he based his character on a real life bishop, but it's a fictional dialogue between a young journalist and an aging bishop. And the point of the poem seems to be that, okay, science is here, we have a new way of thinking, but simple skepticism is not enough. You can't just point your finger at the deficiency of somebody's faith and say that makes you superior, or that is enough to base your life on. That's skepticism. Another writer named Mark Rutherford, his actual name was Hale, said something like, I think I can quote that again too. Oh yeah, here we go. And Mark Rutherford was a classmate of MacDonald when they were studying theology together. He said, to waste a Sunday morning in ridiculing such stories as that of Jonah was certainly as imbecile as to waste it proving their verbal veracity. So just as inane as spending Sunday morning trying to prove that Jonah really existed and was swallowed by a whale, is not a whole lot worse than wasting that Sunday morning proving that, it's just nonsense. It was just made up. Matthew Arnold is probably the one who addressed the whole issue of what the church must do now the most vigorously. He was a poet, but his later works were all prose, and he felt it deep down, and he wasn't just going to feel it, he was going to do something about it. What's that? Dover Beach, right, is one of his poems. But his prose works addressing the issue are called God and the Bible, that's one, and Literature and Dogma. Another, if you're really interested in this idea and want to pursue it further, Carlyle, Ruskin, and Arnold are probably your main people you need to read. And Arnold's book, Literature and Dogma, will tell you a little bit about where he comes from. Here is, I don't know I forget which book this is from, but here's something he's known for stating. At the present moment, two things about Christian religion must surely be clear to anybody with eyes in his head. That was a common attitude of Victorians. They could be opinionated like that. One is that men cannot do without it. The other, that they cannot do with it as it is. So what Arnold has done unabashedly with this statement is anger two of the largest camps, thinking. When he's He's angered those who are very satisfied in ditching religion for the sake of science. But he also angered those who were stubbornly holding to the verbal veracity of the scriptures. He said that he was not speaking to either of those, even though he threw some jibes in at both those camps in his writing. He said he was mostly addressing the people who realized that something had to be done. And what can we do to hang on? He believed firmly that not only spirituality or art was necessary for holding on to some sort of belief outside of science, but he believed firmly in religion itself as vital to what it meant to be human. And his prose work dealt with that. Another thing that he said or quoted, I think that he said it himself, is that we live in between two worlds right now. We live between two worlds. One of them is dead, and the other one is struggling to be born. You can see how that's kind of leaves you feeling precarious if that's your belief. The old world is dead. The new one is still struggling to be born. And he devoted his prose works to his poetry may be seen, you can see elements of elegy, of the lament for the dead world in his poetry. But in his prose work, he was trying to be a midwife to the new world about to be born. And it was drastic, and some people couldn't handle it. While Carlyle, the word you can simplistically, probably identify with him as spirituality, and the arts with Ruskin. It's more complicated than that, but that's a fair summarization. With Arnold, you have two words to remember: culture and conduct. Culture, he said, he defined as the best thoughts that humans have ever had. Very subjective. But he said, we should pay attention and weigh these things. What are the best thoughts we as humans have come up with? And that could be expressed in the arts or literature or whatever. He felt that religion was the epitome of culture, that the highest form of culture was religion, and that any form of art, if it is the best art, will have a religious dimension to it. And so that was what he was arguing for, and that was his motivation for his work. What he wanted to do is take Christian faith and remove it from its foundation on unverifiable stories. So not just the creation story in Genesis, not just the resurrection story of Jesus, but all the miracle stories in the Bible. He said, those can't be proven. Let's not base our faith on them. He still thought they were important, they had value, but if the faith was going to have a future, it could not rest on those stories. He had a German word that he picked up from the German theologians called Aberglaube, that he identified all of the scripture that was what he called, I guess a translation of Aberglaube is something like extra belief. Those are not core beliefs. They're stories that help, but they aren't what we base our faith on. He wanted to believe that you could base the Christian faith on verifiable evidence, something that stood up to scientific scrutiny. And that, he said, was conduct. He said we should base our faith on the conduct that the scripture leads us to have. And we can show how when we behave as the scripture, Old Testament or New Testament, when we can show that if we base our conduct on the values we find in scripture, that will stand up, it will show its value in real terms in society. That in a nutshell is what he said. Don't dare to get too much longer into it because we got to cover F.D. Morris and we haven't gotten to MacDonald yet. F.D. Morris was one of the leaders of what is called the Broad Church movement. You've heard of high church, the concept of high church. Well, in Victorian England, that was particularly important. church belonged to the upper class. You know, the leadership of the church belonged to the aristocracy in many ways. It was tied to aristocracy in many ways. And people on top made decisions for everybody else in the high church way of approaching church. And F.D. Morris, A.G. Scott, Charles Kingsley, and others, including Mark Rutherford, who I mentioned earlier, began a movement of broadening the church. So let's broaden this way. Let's not be so indebted to what people up there tell us to believe, but let's expand, make the church something that reaches out, particularly to the working class, in ways that the church had not spoken before. They became known as Christian socialists because they believed that their mission was to the working class, which working classes kind of saw more threat in the factories than they did in Darwin to their way of life. They weren't worried so much about anything Darwin said. They were worried about what was happening to their lives. Their quality of life was diminishing as these factories started putting science to work for the sake of technologies that didn't exist before. And there was, the Industrial Revolution had a lot of negative social ramifications. And the broad church was developing a theology that was geared toward them. Ruskin got involved not as a necessarily a believer all the time, but he helped develop schools for working class people, so that you didn't have to be a member of a wealthy family to go to university. You could get education as a worker. And MacDonald also helped out in that, teaching in some of these schools in London and elsewhere. I want to, before getting into a summary, I want to some of these people we've talked about. MacDonald was very much influenced by Carlyle. His theology was very dependent upon, very much influenced by Carlyle and Coleridge. Coleridge had an influence Carlyle. And A.J. Scott, they came in early in his life. And he was good friends with Ruskin. MacDonald maintained a good friendship, ongoing friendship with John Ruskin, and identified mostly, of all these responses, identified mostly with this broad church movement. But I want to talk about I decided that this diagram might help give a picture of what was going on in 19th century Britain, where you can see science expanding. The direction of science is expansion. The direction of religion is decreasing, is getting less and less important. And some people even talked about the fact that religion was going to die out altogether. Due to what we see here in the 19th century, religion has an end. It will die out. Science is the wave of the future. To these, you've got to add a lot of other things that are somewhat related. So life was getting more and more industry and urban based and less agriculturally and rurally based. That was a change that was taking place. Imagination, the importance of the imagination, which the Romantics highly prized, Wordsworth and Coleridge, was giving way to rationalism. And we've noticed that poetry was giving way to novels, day-to-day life, real life around us, rather than poetry. Poetry wasn't dying out completely, but its role was decreasing. The natural was elevated over the supernatural. Why do we need the supernatural if if the natural is so much more useful. In this, I want to use the term romanticism, and we can't define that easily. I've spent whole semesters studying romantic writings, and I still can't really give a great definition of what romanticism is all about. But for our purposes here, Wordsworth and then Coleridge really emphasized the importance of nature. And they saw nature as something that was not just an object to living in, but something, a real presence, and that it had a mystical power over us. That we could enter into relationships with nature that were beyond our description. The common person, the common individual was as much value and worth as what these important historical figures that we've always written about our poetry about before. Poetry can focus on the common person just as well as the historical figure. And the imagination is powerful. It's one of our human capacities that we don't fully understand yet, and probably can't understand, but it is an active capacity that we turn toward the world and address the world with. Perception of the mind is not, it's not like a sponge just receiving information, but the mind actively turns itself. There's a power, the power of the imagination is something we had turned to the world. In the human being is an organic creation that keeps on developing and evolving. And so you can see in some of the reactions against science, I'm part of people like Ruskin and Carlyle and Matthew Arnold. You can see some of this as an attempt to bring Coleridge and Wordsworth, bring that dimension of words of the Romantic era into the Victorian age. We get into Shelley, Keats, and Byron, and they expand our notion of romanticism a little bit, but that's, for our purposes, significant to know about romanticism. What do we do in this kind of schema? Where would you think we put fairy tales? I want to put it in that's declining, and yet the 19th century, the Victorian era, saw a kind of surge in fairy tales, and that kind of puzzles me. Might be partially explained by the fact there was a baby boom, and at one point there's a couple of decades, maybe even more than 2 decades, where the population under 15 years old was larger than the population over 15 years old. So there was a baby boom, and fairy tales are often used in didactical ways. And so that partially explains it. But I want to at least leave room for a belief that that fairy tales were important for another reason in our understanding of truth. Any questions to this point? Okay, good. Here's a picture that some artists compiled from separate portraits of some of the underneath the portrait, it just says literary figures of the Victorian era. This is done fairly contemporaneously with these writers. The four in front are Thackeray, novelists we haven't talked about, Macaulay, an essayist we haven't talked about. Then the third one is Thomas Carlyle. This guy right here, and you might recognize this as Charles Dickens on the end. And in the back, the guy in the middle, I could find out for you if you really want to know. I have it. I have to take some time. I won't do that, but I won't identify for the others in the back, three of the others in the back, except this one right there is George MacDonald. So he was listed, in this photograph at least, as one of the eminent Victorian writers. Probably one of the 4 or 5 there that you've never heard of before. He was born in Huntly, Scotland, in 1824. He went into the university. He spent time in the university in Aberdeen, got a degree there, studied a range of things, including natural philosophy, or I think what they were specifically teaching at that college was chemistry. So he thought he might go into chemistry and become a doctor, but he didn't. After he graduated, he went to London and tried to make a living as a tutor. I was hired immediately as a tutor for a family, and that didn't please him all that much, either financially or intellectually. And he went into a theological college in London, where he continued to shed his Calvinism. Coming from Scotland, he got a fair dose of that. He felt it was a problem because it contradicted, sorry if any of you are avid Calvinists, but for him, it contradicted a lot of the other things that he was learning intuitively from the Bible about his faith. And so his faith was somewhat conflicted. In his theological studies, he continued the work of, he just could not conceive of a God so intent on either punishment or reward, for one thing. He was attracted there. This is when he began to be attracted to the broad church movement, people like A.J. Scott and F.D. Morris. He did, in the process, find his wife. I forget if they were married before. I think before he took his first church position. It didn't work out well. He was, by all appearances, he was well liked as a preacher, except by those on the top, the people who control the purse strings of the church. The fact that George MacDonald was, you call him a universalist. He did not believe in eternal damnation. He felt that if God's love meant anything, if God's love was indeed strong, it would not give up, and it would find a way to win over everybody. So in a nutshell, that's what he believed. There were some other beliefs about the importance of animals in God's scheme of things and stuff that seemed heretical to these church leaders. They started decreasing his salary. The people would supplement it by bringing food by the house. He was growing a family, beginning a family at a time. Eventually, I think this includes all 11 of his children. When the pastoral ministry didn't work out, he turned to writing poetry, started writing poetry, and then fantasy, started writing fairy tales, one for adults called Fantastes, most of them for children. But those didn't sell all that well yet. So he got convinced he should write novels. His poetry and his novels influenced me, impact me the least, just because I'm least attracted to that. Maybe I'm a good poet. He was not a great poet, although people would differ with me. Some people differ with me. And his novels have never attracted me. They're a little bit too preachy for me. But I'm going to reconsider, because I've heard other people say, well, if you take his novels, where he addresses religion directly, there's a lot of religious characters, and you read them as fairy tales, they are very interesting. So I might give his novels another chance, but basically it's his fantasy that stood the test of time. Here he is reading to one of his daughters. I think this is Mary. Mary is important because here she is next to, this is not, you may recognize him, it's not George, this is Mrs. MacDonald there on your left, but the man in the middle is Lewis Carroll, who started hanging out with the MacDonalds, attracted to George MacDonald's mind. Some people believe that some of MacDonald's early writings very directly influenced Alice's adventures in Wonderland, or as originally titled, Underground. Probably the white cat, Alice's white cat, is indebted to Mary's kitten Snowball. But what we know for sure is that the MacDonald children, pictured here, had a direct impact on its publication because Lewis Carroll was reluctant to print, to publish the Alice stories. And his publisher wanted him to. He was not satisfied with his publisher's opinion. And so he sent them off to the MacDonalds. He says, read these to your kids. Let me know what they think. And it was Grayville MacDonald, the boy here, next to his mother, who said, there should be 90,000 volumes of it, or some great number like that. I forget what the number was. Maybe it was less than 90,000, but he reacted so enthusiastically that Lewis Carroll decided to publish the Alice works. Lewis Carroll was not the only one that got attracted to MacDonald. As I mentioned, Ruskin before, and other Victorians. And when MacDonald did a lecture tour, MacDonald started doing a lot of lectures besides writing. And we came to the United States. All the bigwigs, Longfellow came to hear him, Mark Twain. I can list some others later. I'm not going to look it up right now, but some people even believe that MacDonald's novel, which is a very Dickensian novel called Sir Gibbie, had a direct influence on Huckleberry Finn. I have not followed that lead. But what is true is that a lot of people sensed in George MacDonald a sage. They sensed that he had a gift that they wanted to get close to. They wanted to talk to him and interact with him. It was felt even in this country as he toured, mostly the Midwest and the East Coast. We are going to focus on one particular story written in 1872, The Princess and the Goblin. Because I think it says some specific things about this whole conflict between science and faith, not in a direct way. MacDonald did address science in that, but basically he was not too concerned about talking about science specifically. He never saw science as a threat. We'll find out some of the reasons why. But his faith was not based in a way that it created a major conflict for him. But I think he helps his age and ours at the same time through his vision, this sage reputation that he had. Some people talk about it as, well, George MacDonald himself addressed it in these terms, that he saw himself as a guide, a pilgrimage guide to those entering the fairy world. This world that we can't describe scientifically, that we can't explore realistically, that we don't have empirical evidence for, but we can enter. And he saw himself as a guide into that world. About The Princess and the Goblin, G.K. Chesterton Um, and by the way, Chesterton was one of those folks who hung out with C.S. Lewis in Oxford, in Oxford, along with Tolkien and others. We know a lot of MacDonald has been preserved because C.S. Lewis considered him his champ. C.S. Lewis felt he was the person closest to Christ he had ever come in contact with, and MacDonald only through his writings. So a lot of what we know about MacDonald has been preserved by those who are in love with C.S. Lewis, Wheaton College in particular. And I think that they've been helpful, but I don't think that we can rely on them solely if we want to truly understand George MacDonald. But this is what MacDonald said about Princess and the Goblin. I, for one, can testify to a book that has made a difference to my whole existence, which helped me to see things in a certain way from the start, a vision of things which even so real a revolution as a change of religious allegiance, which Chesterton underwent, has substantially only crowned and confirmed. Of all the stories I have read, including even all the novels of the same novelist, it remains the most real, the most realistic, in the exact sense of the phrase, the most like life. It is called Princess and the Goblin. You don't have to read the book and have the same reaction that G.K. Chesterton. That almost sounds hyperbolic to me. I won't question it. I don't necessarily share it. It hasn't affected me as much. But I do invite you to explore the possibilities. There's no expectation when you read it. You don't have to feel the same way Chesterton did, but do read it with a clean slate. You don't have to worry about this faith and science thing that I've spent today discussing. You don't read it as a story you just come across. If you can put up with 19th century language, you can read the story and enjoy it. You will have to put up with a little bit of sentimentalism too, which was characteristic of fairy tale writing of the age. A little bit of didacticism, but not a whole lot. But read it with the possibility of agreeing that a dream may be full of truth and a fact a mere shred for the winds of the limbo of vanities. If you don't have a copy yet, there are some copies back there in the box that you can buy very inexpensively. Some of them are new. Most of them are used, but they'll all cost you less than $4. Well, most of them less than $2, $2 or $3. Or if you want to buy a copy for someone else, also help yourself to that. I had been saving them. I'm no longer going to be saving them. I collected them. I'm no longer going to be collecting them, so you can help that to it. I did bring some copies. I will have more next week. But if you have already finished with The Princess and the Goblin, can't wait to read more, I have some copies of the sequel, The Princess and Curdie. If you wish to read that, you can buy one of these. These you can just look at if you want to get idea. I might have some you can borrow next week, but some of the other is stories. So you're welcome to come this direction too, as well as that table if you need a book. But our main problem to resolve today is what to do with the third session that got wiped out last week by the snow. What I want to propose, the following Thursday after next week, after the 6th, I said we can't, it's too much reading if we would combine sections, so I don't want to do that. If we do it the following Thursday, we have to do it in the morning. If we want this same time slot, a Thursday afternoon, we have to wait till the 20th. I'm willing to do that. We could also go to the 27th if for some reason 20th, but let's aim for the 20th. Um, and if we can't get enough people together, we'll go with whatever we have, and then you can listen to our discussion later. But in that third discussion, we'll do enough follow-up comments on Princess and the Goblin if necessary, but look at some other writings. I include so many other writings. They're not to force you to read anything. They're all optional, but to leave space in case you've read something already that that you are reminded of by this class, by the issues that we've dealt with. If you've read something that you feel has something to say, you're welcome to come and talk about that. You don't have to talk about anything you read, but you will have the floor. You will have the opportunity to talk about any of your readings. You can introduce one of the other fairy tales to the rest of us, etc. What is your feeling about either going on the 13th of February in the morning, or waiting till the 20th to do it in the afternoon? Either way would work. Wait for the 20th, do the afternoon. Okay. Does anyone have a strong problem of, it gives you extra time for reading, so that could be a good thing. All right. So let's do that. February 20th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we will meet on February 6th, right? So next week, hopefully we'll have the Princess and the Goblin read by then. Any other further questions? Okay. Yes. Oh, I've kind of, while the microphone is coming up here, I've kind of ignored you folks who are watching online, but you are not forgotten. If you do have a question that you want addressed regarding this session, please email it, and I will either address you personally, or we could, if with your permission, bring it up at the beginning of next class.
I'm just wondering about what age were these men at the height of their thing? And want to relate that to what was going on in the United States at that time and things like that.
Okay. Well, I mentioned Mark Twain being a contemporary, so if that helps, and Longfellow, so if that helps with his relationship with what's going on this side of the country. We'll talk a little bit about Dickens in one of our upcoming sessions, because I think that he is significant too, even though he didn't write fairy tales. And Dickens had a big following in this country. Their ages, I did not mark down their birth dates except for George MacDonald's in 1824. MacDonald made it into his 90s. Not all of them did. I mentioned that sad case of the Romantics, dying out in reverse order. But I will look up some of their ages, and I know that Matthew Arnold was a lot more popular, or well known, both in England and the United States than he is today, and that is a sad situation. I think important. I think he probably he has a reputation for being the most intellectually astute of all those folks we talked about. He may not have been accepted by everybody, but he was definitely one of the most passionate. And he was the one that my earlier paper gave short shrift to. We'll talk a little bit more about how that happened. Yes.
This is kind of a rational question. So he didn't do too well as a pastor. He had 11 children. What did they live on if you didn't sell stuff right away?
Yeah, sometimes not much at all. They lived in dire poverty, and that was noticed by some of the people he was attracting that were becoming aware of him. Lady Byron was an early patron, Byron's widow, and others. Ruskin helped him out a lot, financially. So people who recognize that he is a gifted person, helped him out. But the writings, the novels sold well as far as that goes, much better than the poetry or the fairy tales. And so even though those aren't considered his greatest gifts, I could be mistaken, I'll keep an open mind, even though they were the most sellable. People wanted novels, in that age. And, he had enough more people read his novels in this country today, thanks to Wheaton College, than probably did back then, but at least as many. So. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And if you too, those of you who are here, have a question that comes to you and you want to address later, feel free to email me. On the syllabus, you have that email address, I believe. So good. Correct. February 6th and then February 20th, both at 1. Thank you for making that decision so easy.